Hey, this is Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Today I'm going to show you how to rebuild the bottom end on your YZ250 or YZ250X. Now there's a few different reasons you're going to be splitting your cases and getting into the bottom end of your engine. You could have transmission or shifting issues, or more commonly on these two strokes, you're going to have issues with the crankshaft assembly. Now if the main bearings or connecting rod bearing is going bad, you're either going to have bad vibration coming from the engine, or you're going to hear a knocking noise coming from that bottom end. So if you have either of these issues, we're going to show you how to get them taken care of. And this bike right here, we actually had a connecting rod bearing that seized up. So let's go ahead and jump into this. This bike is a 2009 YZ250, but the procedure is going to be similar from 1999 and newer models for YZ250s and YZ250Xs. Just be sure to refer to your model-specific service manual for more information, proper procedures, and specs. To do this job, we're going to need some common hand tools, including a torque wrench, snap ring pliers, and some gasket scrapers. You will need a few specialty tools to get this job done. So we have our crankcase splitter, a clutch holding tool. This doubles as a flywheel holder. We have our flywheel puller, feeler gauges, digital caliper, and then a few tools that will make the job a lot easier. You don't necessarily have to have these, but a Motion Pro gear jammer, our seal driver, seal puller, impact driver, rags, safety glasses, and rubber gloves. To do this job, we have the Wiseco bottom end rebuild kit. This comes with the crankshaft assembly, your two main bearings, gaskets, and seals that you need to do the job. Then we also have a lock washer for the clutch hub nut. You can get this under the OEM parts diagram. Then we also have some Yamaha Bond, contact cleaner, assembly lube, some Loctite, and some grease. To get this bottom end disassembled, the first thing you'll need to do is tear down the top end. So as you can see, we've already done that on ours, and if you need help getting to this point, check out our video on the top end rebuild for the YZ250. So to rebuild this bottom end, we need to remove the engine from the bike. So what we're going to do is drain our transmission fluid. We remove our shift lever, remove the stator cover, and disconnect the clutch cable. And then we can disconnect our stator wires. Next, we need to remove the countershaft sprocket. To do that, we'll remove the case saver, and then we'll straighten the tabs on this locking washer. Now we'll remove our countershaft sprocket nut. This is a 32mm socket, and I'm going to hold the rear brake while I loosen it. Now we can remove the nut and the lock washer, and then we'll remove the countershaft sprocket. If your bike has frame guards like ours does, you'll need to remove them to get to the swing arm pivot bolt. The next step is on the other side, and we're going to remove our radiator hose, the Kickstarter, and our rear brake pedal. Now we're ready to remove the nuts on these motor mounts, and then we also have a nut on the swing arm pivot bolt on the other side. We'll remove that, and then once the nuts are off, we'll remove all three bolts. And once those bolts are removed, we can remove the engine from the frame. Now when you remove these swing arm pivot bolts, sometimes they can be stuck. For ours, it was stuck in there pretty good, and we had to use some penetrating lube and let it soak in for a little bit before we could remove it. So you might have to do that if yours is stuck, and that's why it's so important to put grease on these when you go back and reassemble them to prevent these from getting seized in the swing arm. It's best if you don't have to hammer this out, but since we might have to replace this bolt. Now that we have our engine out of the frame, we've gone ahead and moved it to the workbench and mounted it up in our engine stand. This one's from Motorsport Products, and what's nice about these engine stands, if you've never used one before, is they hold everything still and sturdy while you're loosening bolts and removing components. And while you're taking everything apart, you're going to have some residual oil coming out, and it has a drip pan to catch all that and keep from making a mess. With that being said, the next thing we're going to do is remove the flywheel. To remove the flywheel, we need to hold this still while we loosen this nut. So to hold it still, we're using the Tusk flywheel holding tool, and then we'll use a 17mm socket, hold our tool, and break this nut loose. And just make sure you get the washer behind the nut out. Next, we'll take our flywheel puller. This is a reverse thread, and we'll screw it into the flywheel, and the center bolt will tighten it down, and it's going to press against the crankshaft and pop our flywheel off. The next step is to clean any dirt from around this stator. The next step is to remove the stator. Now, the stator does have adjustable timing, so you want to check these timing marks down here, and you want to mark where they're actually at. I'm going to use a Sharpie to do that. You could use a scratch awl, but just make sure you get it back to its original location. To remove the stator, we'll loosen up these 3 Phillips head bolts with an impact driver. The next thing we'll do is remove this right crankcase cover, and it is not necessary to remove the clutch cover or water pump cover on this YZ250. So the bolts that we don't need to remove, I just marked with a black Sharpie. We'll remove everything else and pull all the covers off as one assembly. As you loosen the bolts, you want to do it in a crisscross pattern. Also pay attention to where these bolts go, because there will be 3 different sizes of bolts. With all of the bolts removed, you can rock the cover back and forth to remove it. If it doesn't come off just by rocking it by hand, you can use a mallet to help break it loose. With the cover removed, you want to make sure you locate your dowel pins, because sometimes they can be left in the cover or the case. We're going to remove both of those and set them aside. And then the next thing we'll do is remove this governor assembly. To do that, we're going to pull up on the actuating arm and rock this out of place. And on ours, since we're going to be replacing all the seals, we're going to remove the power valve actuating arm. To do that, we'll remove these 2 3mm head bolts. The next thing we need to do is break the bolt loose for our primary drive gear. And to help do that, we're going to use this Motion Pro gear jammer. Motion Pro makes a lot of different tools to help make the job easier, and this tool is no exception. All you do, we'll stick it in between the gears, and this actually has a magnet to help hold it in place. And we'll break the nut loose, or the bolt loose. And then we'll proceed to the clutch disassembly. Now, before we remove anything from the clutch, just keep in mind we're actually laying out clean rags, and we're laying everything out in order so it's clean and organized. And you just want to stay organized throughout the process to help with reassembly. To remove the clutch, we'll loosen up these 6 bolts in a crisscross pattern, and then we'll remove the pressure plate. Okay, with the pressure plate off, you're going to want to inspect where the friction disc rides on the pressure plate and make sure that it's smooth and there's no grooving. And also make sure this surface where our throwout bearing rides is in good condition. After that, we'll remove the throwout bearing assembly and just make sure that this bearing is in good condition and rotates smoothly. After that, we'll remove our push rod. And now we can remove these friction discs. So on these discs, what we can do is measure the thickness in several different places and compare them to spec. A lot of times, if they're bad, you can tell that they're burned and glazed. As you remove the steel plates, you're going to inspect those as well. The main thing you're looking for is any bluing or discoloration. If they're blued, that means these plates are going to be warped and you want to replace the clutch pack. I'm going to remove the rest of the stack and we'll inspect it on the bench. Next, we'll inspect the clutch basket, and these fingers coming out, you want to feel if they have grooves on them. If the grooves are deep, you want to replace the basket. The other check you can do is make sure that the gear on the back side doesn't move separate from the basket itself. If that happens, you have some bushings in the back that have gone bad and you need to get those replaced. Other than that, on this hub in the center, you have these splines and you need to check those for grooving as well. And if they're very deep, you'll need to replace that. Next, we need to flatten the tab on this locking washer so we can remove the nut on the hub. To loosen the hub nut, we need to use our Tusk clutch holding tool. And we're just going to put this in the splines. And when you clamp it down, you just want to clamp it down loosely. You don't want to damage the soft aluminum. And then we're actually using a 29mm socket to loosen this up. So we'll remove the nut and the locking washer. After that, we'll remove this hub. Now, behind the hub, you have a splined washer, and you're going to need to rotate that on the splines to remove it. Then after that, we can actually remove the clutch basket, but keep in mind, there's going to be a collar, a needle bearing, and a washer behind here. So just be careful, you don't want to drop them, and make sure you keep track of them. With our clutch off, we'll remove this primary drive bolt, as well as the water pump and primary drive gear. Behind those, we have another spline washer, so you'll line that up and remove it. Next, we'll remove this Kickstarter assembly, and to do that, we're going to need to release this spring. And we'll just pull the assembly out as one unit. Keep in mind, when you pull it out, you're going to have a washer right behind here, and you don't want to lose that. Next, we'll remove the snap ring for our kickstart idler gear. When you pull it off, pay attention to the orientation. You've got a round side and a flat side. The flat side is going to be facing out. Then we'll remove the idler gear. We've got a washer on the front side of that. After that, we can remove the shift shaft. Now, keep in mind, the side where your shift lever goes on, make sure that's clean before you push it through. And then right here, we have a little collar. We're going to want to remove that and set it aside so we don't lose it. At this point, we can remove our shifting mechanism. So we'll just loosen these two bolts and remove it as an assembly. Now, if this assembly does come apart on you, don't worry too much. We'll show you how to reassemble it when we go back together with the motor. Looking back a couple steps, make sure you get the washer that's on the shift shaft. I almost missed it since it's stuck to the case. Next, we need to remove the bolt that goes down into our shift drum. We'll remove this shift segment. Then we'll remove the bolt for the stopper lever arm. And you can see that we have a bad stopper arm bearing, so we need to make sure we get that replaced on reassembly. We also need to remove the bracket that holds on our spring and holds the seal in place. Back on the other side, now that we have the clutch push rod out of the way, we're going to remove this clutch actuating arm. To do that, I'm going to take a 4mm Allen key We'll remove this bolt. And then we can just slide this arm all the way out. And on this, you want to make sure this corner isn't rounded. If this thing is rounded off, you're going to want to replace it. The next thing we'll do on this side is remove this collar for the countershaft, and we're just going to use some channel locks to do that. We'll just be gentle with it. So this collar is actually seized into place, and we're going to have to remove it after we split the cases and push this countershaft through. At this point, we're almost ready to start splitting the cases. To do that, we need to remove all of the bolts that are holding the cases together, and we'll remove all of these bolts in a crisscross pattern. Again, with these bolts, pay attention to where they go. You're going to have a couple of different sizes. At this point, we're ready to split these cases, and since we're using an engine stand, we need to remove anything that's going to prevent these cases from splitting. So if you're using a stand like ours, we'll just remove this nut, and then we can install our crankcase splitter. So at this point, we can use our crankcase splitter, and what this does, these arms are going to pull up on the crankcase half, and the center pin is going to push on the crankshaft. Separate the two. This is going to be the easiest and safest way to split the crankcases. To do that, we'll center the splitter on the crankshaft, and then these arms, you want to separate them so they're pretty even all the way around, and then we'll install the all thread. You want even heights on the nuts that are on the all thread, and that way when you're pulling everything apart, it pulls up on the case evenly. Okay, once the crankcase splitter is installed, we'll use a 17mm socket, and we'll start tightening this down and slowly split the cases. And if you noticed anywhere binding up, you can use the soft base mallet and tap on the crankcase half to help separate it. Now once everything is freed up, we'll remove our splitter and the right crankcase half. And when you pull this off, just be aware of any washers or anything that falls down like dowel pins, and keep track of them. Now that we have the right crankcase half off, we can remove the transmission and our shift drum along with the shift forks. Now, a lot of bikes you can remove these pieces individually, but on the YZs, you have to remove all these components as an assembly. And one tip the manual gives us is to tap on the countershaft with a mallet to help drive these out. And as you lay these down, just keep track of all the parts and lay them out in order. All right, now we need to get the crankshaft removed from the other case half, and to do that, we're again going to use the crankcase splitter. Now, as we do this, it's going to be the same process as the other side, except we're actually pressing the crankshaft out of the case half, and the case half is going to stay stationary. And as you can see, since we had a bad connecting rod bearing, we have all kinds of copper pieces down in the crankcase halves. Now, one thing I do want to point out about the crankshaft is you need to keep track of your woodruff key because you will need to reuse that. Next, we'll remove the dowel pins from our crank halves. This dowel pin seized in there, so I'm using a socket that's about the same size, and we are going to have to replace it, but the socket will keep this from collapsing. And if you do it this way, just be really careful that you don't mark up this gasket sealing surface. Next, we'll remove the seals in our case halves, and there's one seal for that power valve actuating arm in the right crankcase cover. And as you go throughout this process, just make sure you don't mark up the sealing surface. We'll also remove this O-ring, and then we'll clean up our crankcase halves and our right crankcase cover, and we'll do that with some gasket scrapers, some contact cleaner, and maybe even a little bit of Scotch-Brite. You want to get all of the gasket material gone as well as any sealing material, and then make sure you clean up your transmission bearings really well, and we'll show you how to inspect those after we're cleaned up. And when you're cleaning the surfaces around the bearing, it's a good idea to cover the bearings up, and that way you don't get any debris down in there. All right, with our crankcase halves cleaned up, what we need to do is put a little bit of light oil on these bearings. We'll rotate them and make sure they spin freely. And we'll also check this inner race, make sure there's no play in that. If any of these bearings are rough or there's play on that inner race, you want to get them replaced. Now we went through on ours and we're actually replacing all of our transmission bearings. And then anytime you're in the crankcase halves, you do want to replace these crankshaft bearings. So we'll get those replaced as well. And the last thing, since we did have a connecting rod failure, you want to inspect the crankcase, make sure there's no damage to either side, because sometimes when you have those failures, you can have some serious damage. All right, to get these bearings replaced, we're going to use two different methods. On the bearings that you can get to the back side of the inner race, we're going to use a bearing driver to punch those out. And then the bearings that you can't get to the back side, we'll use a blindside bearing puller on those. The other thing to point out, some of these bearings will have retainers, and you'll need to remove those retainers. So now we're going to go through both cases and remove all of our bearings. And to help get these bearings out just a little easier, we're going to apply some heat with the heat gun to the case. So the blindside bearing puller is this piece. We're going to collapse this down into the center race of the bearing, and then we'll tighten this piece down. It's going to lock these fingers out, and then we can use a slide hammer and pull the bearing out. Again, we're going to be driving these bearings. You can gain access to the inner race from the back side with a bearing driver, but if you don't have that, you can use a socket to press these out. Just be careful not to damage the cases. Now you can continue this process for the rest of the bearings in both case halves. And keep in mind, you want to make sure you note the direction of the bearing when it's coming out. Some of these have one side that has a cover on them, so pay attention to that and pay attention to any markings on the bearing. All right, moving on to the transmission. I'm going to remove this O-ring. All right, so we've already cleaned these gears off with contact cleaner so we can get a better look at them. Now, all of these straight cut gears, including the idler gears and other gears on your motorcycle, you want to inspect them for any pitting, and you want to make sure there's no visible damage or broken teeth. And then the other thing about this, we have gear dogs down in here, and for these gear dogs, you want to make sure it has a nice sharp corner. If it's rounded off, that's where you're going to get the bike jumping out of gear. Now, we didn't have any issues with our transmission when we took this bike apart. And if you do, we have a more in-depth transmission inspection video, but just some of the common things you want to check in here are those two we already mentioned, but also make sure that the spline gears slide back and forth easily. Then you have your freewheeling gears. You want to make sure those rotate freely. And then last, this gear right here, this one is fixed, and the inspection on that is the same as any other straight cut tooth gear. So as you can see, we have a nice square corner right here, and you want to make sure this gear that matches with it you want to make sure the edges that it rides against have a nice square edge as well. The next thing we'll inspect are the shift forks, and on these forks we have pads on them. So what we can do is take our digital caliper, we'll take a reading on that pad and we'll compare it to the spec in our service manual. The other thing about these, we have a pin that rides in the shift drum. If you have a lot of wear or flat spots on this pin, then chances are that your shift drum is going to have some worn out spots on that too. So you want to inspect both of those, make sure these aren't worn down. And then the other inspection you want to make sure is that these shafts aren't bent. And how you do that with this style, you're going to have to actually install this shaft into the case haft and make sure it slides smoothly. The next thing we'll inspect is our kickstart idler gear. And this right here, we're going to inspect this bushing, make sure there's no grooving or excessive wear. If it looks questionable, you can take a measurement and compare that reading to the spec in the service manual. Now moving on, we have our clutch release arm, and this is something you want to inspect. These bikes, a lot of times you'll get a corner rounding off right here, and this is going to make it so the bike isn't fully disengaging when you pull the clutch in. So if it's rounded off, you want to replace that, and you also want to inspect this push rod. If the corners of this push rod are damaged, you want to replace that as well. And that's it for disassembly and inspection for the YZ250 bottom end. This is part one of a two-part series for the bottom end rebuild. So if you want to know how to put this thing back together, we'll show you how to get that done in part two. And if you need any parts for this, we have a lot of different options for parts on our website. We offer free shipping on orders over $75. And if you need to know how to put your top end back on, we also have a video for that. So check it out and subscribe to our YouTube channel because we have a lot of other helpful videos on there. Thanks for watching.